All right. So hello, Elizabeth Thompson. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, your current position, your connections to Paramore, and anything else you would like for us to know.
Okay, that's always so quite a lot. My name is Elizabeth Thompson, and currently I serve as the director for community engagement for the UCF Valencia downtown campus. Uh, so that is one of the ties to Paramore because, of course, that downtown campus is in the Paramore area. Prior to joining the UCF Valencia downtown campus, I was the executive director for the Association to Preserve African American Society, History, and Tradition. We go by the acronym PAST. And one of the flagship endeavors of PAST is the running of the WellsBuilt Museum of African American History and Culture. And that museum, again, is in Paramore. And the museum is housed in a building that is more than 90 plus years old. That building was the very first hotel in Orlando that would rent rooms to African Americans. And so therein is yet another tie to Paramore. So for several years on a daily basis, I would go to the museum. It was my definite great pleasure to be able to speak with visitors and tourists alike who would come to learn about the African American contribution to Orlando and the Central Florida area. And so, again, that's another tie to the Paramore area. That, and of course, having to research and read and familiarize myself with the history of Paramore and with the contributions that African Americans have made in and around Orlando.
All right. Would you be willing to describe community life in Paramore before 1970?
Sure. I wasn't there because I'm not quite that old, but from my research and from what I understand, obviously Paramore was the historically Black area of town of Orlando. And so if you were an African American living in the Orlando area, you were going to be living in that Paramore area. And so you had an area of town that had multi-level of economic contributions. So you would have your doctors and your lawyers who were living next door to educators and agricultural workers. And so you had a very comprehensive stratification where all of the monies were going into and concentrating in this Paramore area. This was in times of segregation where Black people would go for recreation, for lodging, for business, to patronize businesses. And if you owned a business as a Black person, it was going to be in that area. So you had a thriving community, a community where a lot of times what was good for one person economically turned out to be good for the collective economy. And so you had a lot of interconnectedness, you had a lot of access. And so this is where you would go as an African American person in your personal time, certainly. And so that was the tenor of the community, kind of the collective thought, the interconnectedness, and like I said, it was a thriving area prior to that.
All right. What was the impact of the Great Depression and the World War II on Paramore?
Well, you had a lot of residents who enlisted. And so you had people who were going to war. And then whenever you have jobs that cease, then that is always felt in your minority communities, that the impact is very great and large in the minority communities. And again, you have to understand, like, Florida in general was so heavy in agricultural work. We were the state of citrus. I say were, I'm not sure if we still are. I think that's California now. But in any event, a lot of earning happened in agricultural work. And so if you have people who are losing jobs and losing monies and losing opportunities to have housing and things like that, of course, the impact is going to be felt. If you have young, people, men at the time, particularly who were going away and leaving homes and leaving families and leaving jobs, then of course that was going to also have a great impact on the family structure, on the sustainability of their homes and businesses and things of that nature. So, I mean, I think the impact is great. I know it was great in general, but there is a saying that if the country catches a cold, then Black people get the flu. So a lot of times things are felt at a higher level in the minority communities, particularly African-American communities.
All right. So in the late 1940s, the businesses in Paramore formed the Orlando Negro Chamber of Commerce. What can you tell us about the businesses in Paramore in the middle of the 20th century?
Again, I think it's one of those things where there was an almost inherent support system. So now where you have this huge marketing push and you want to get customers from here and there and everywhere to know about your business and to patronize your business, when you have all of these businesses kind of concentrated in one area and prohibited, because the facts of the matter are that white people by and large didn't patronize Black businesses. Whereas Black people might patronize white businesses, white people weren't going out of their way to patronize Black businesses. And a lot of times weren't even coming into the community. But so you had this inherent support, this inherent customer base where Black people supported businesses that were owned by Black people in these communities. And what that would do is it would allow again, the circulation of the dollar to remain in that community. So if I am earning $10, but I need food, I'm going to the local grocery store. If I need my clothes tailored, I'm going to that laundry tailor shop that is in my neighborhood. And so a lot of those things, they're what buoyed one person, buoyed the economy as a whole. And I always say that if you think about crime, right, a lot of crimes are born out of lack, out of a need. But if you have these businesses that are thriving, and I know what's good for me is also good for you, and what's good for you is also good for me, then the crime is not there because it's counterproductive. So you have a safe environment. You have an environment where people are comfortable. You have an environment where they're investing in one another, not just monetarily, but also through efforts and time and things of that nature. So it was a very, thriving and interconnected community in that time. And people who did have businesses supported one another. Either through bartering of services, bartering of goods, or purchase of things. So you had a lot of cross-industrial support as well.
Could you tell us about Dr. William Monroe Wells' struggles to build the WellsBuilt Hotel and Casino?
Absolutely. So Dr. Wells was the second African-American physician to come to the Orlando area. The first was a gentleman, Dr. Callahan. So Dr. Wells and his wife were relocating from Tennessee. He had gone to Meharry Medical College, which is in Tennessee, and they were looking for a geography where they could start a medical practice and therefore start a life. And they looked at Orlando, the Central Florida, or Orlando being in Central Florida allowed for African Americans particularly to be able to travel throughout the state via train and harvest different crops in different areas. So again, we circle back to where we were talking about agriculture being one of the main industries of Florida. If I live in Central Florida, then I can get to South Florida, I can get to North Florida, I can go east, I can go west relatively easy, as opposed to, let's say, living in Pensacola and trying to go to Miami. Even now, we understand that that's like a 9-hour, 10-hour trek. But if you live in the center of the state, you can make those trips and you can harvest the different crops. So I can live in Central Florida and work citrus fields, work citrus groves, but I can travel to South Florida and harvest sugarcane, or I can travel to North Florida and harvest corn or celery. So by living in Central Florida, it allowed for a lot of different economic options. And what that meant was you were going to have an African-American population. And because there was only one physician at the time, you were going to have a need. So he and his wife, Dr. Wells and his wife, relocated to Orlando in 1917. And when he got here, what he did notice is that there were businesses and there was industry, but the businesses, or particularly hotels, would not rent rooms to African-American travelers. They would not. So he understood that there was going to be a need for Black people to have an option as it pertains to hotels. And so he decided that he would build that hotel. But even though he was a physician, even though he had a thriving practice, even though he had discretionary income at that time, he was still a Black man and he could not get commercial financing. So he had to fund the entirety of the construction himself. So he would take proceeds from his medical practice and he would put them then into the construction of the WellsBuilt Hotel. And so that process took several years because, you know, he was doing it incrementally, as opposed to now where we might go to a bank and get a lump sum. He was having to do it little by little. So it took him several years. And, you know, that in and of itself is an impediment. If there were a counterpart physician with a thriving practice, then that person he probably could have gotten a loan. But because Dr. Wells was African-American, he was not able to do that. And so he had to fund the construction himself. And so a lot of times, not just in the case of Dr. Wells, but there were so many more impediments to starting a business and sustaining a business as an African-American. And that is actually something that Dr. Wells understood. And so I don't know if, I know we've had some students who come to the museum. I don't know if you all have been physically, but Dr. Wells, the WellsBuilt was a 2-story building. And he intentionally put all of the hotel rooms upstairs. He intentionally left downstairs to be offered as a storefront for other Black business owners, because he understood that it was not quite as easy for a Black business owner to build their own building. It was not quite as easy to get a lease. It was not quite as easy to start your business. And so the downstairs portion, which coincidentally is where the museum itself, the bulk of the museum is housed, the downstairs were storefront spaces that he rented to other Black business owners. And again, that was something that it didn't just benefit him as a landlord, so to speak, but it benefited the whole community, because now these businesses are there and they are employing other Black people in the area. And when they are needing supplies or things of that nature, they're purchasing from other Black businesses in the area. And so by allowing or reserving this space for Black business owners, it actually helped buoy the economy of the surrounding community. And those were things that he was very intentional about, and kind of a visionary, I always say, because you have to know that this hotel opened in the late 1920s. And so for more than a decade, actually for more than, I think it was 2 decades, he was the only hotel in town that would rent rooms to African Americans. So he had a forethought. And some people say, you know, well, he could have maximized hotel stay by having 2 stories of hotel rooms. But for him, it wasn't worth it. The benefit lie not just in providing lodging, but also providing a space for people to own and operate their own businesses. I think also you might have asked about the South Street Casino, which he built, owned, and operated as well. And that was on property that was immediately adjacent to the WellsBuilt Hotel at the time. And it was not a gambling hall, but instead an event venue. You could go and see, I guess, concerts or live performances. You could host gatherings, family gatherings, celebratory gatherings. And in the day, some of the space was used even as a rec or recreational space. So it was kind of a multi-purpose, multi-use building. Again, we're talking times of segregation. So as it pertains to live performances, if you wanted to perform for an African-American audience, you were going to have to do that in the African-American community. There were performance venues, but they were segregated. And so Black people were not able to just go to the auditoriums that might have been on Orange or Livingston. And so if you wanted to perform for an African-American audience, you were going to have to do that in the Black community. And for a lot of people, the South Street Casino was exactly that venue.
All right. Can you please describe the access to healthcare for citizens of Paramore? Who were the Black physicians serving the community, and what hospital facilities were available?
So if we, again, at one point in time, the first African-American physician was Dr. Callahan. And then Dr. Wells came. And so for a period of time, there were two African-American physicians in the Paramore area. And this was at a time, I think now we are used to, if I asked you about your doctor, you might have 3 or 4, right? You might have this person who specializes in dermatology, or this person who specializes in gynecology, or a family practice, or a gerontologist. But at that point in time, you really had one doctor, and he was going to do all of those things. And so you had 2 African Americans who were caring for the entirety of the Orlando Black population. And there even came a point in time when Dr. Callahan went to care for soldiers, African-American soldiers at war. So there was a period of time when Dr. Wells was the only African-American physician in Orlando. And as a Black person, you were going to be seen by a Black doctor. White doctors did not have to care for African-Americans. And sometimes they would choose not to. Sometimes they would if it was advantageous, but by and large, you were going to, as a Black person, see a Black doctor. And so the access there, even just from a time constraint, is not always, it wasn't always the most. But you had, as far as hospitals, and I know you asked about hospitals, a lot of times you had, they made house calls. They would come see you where you were. Dr. Wells did build an annex onto his residential home where you could enter and be seen in this annex without actually having to go into his living room or what have you. And then there were hospitals that would reserve maybe a floor or a space on a floor where Black people, Black patients could be seen. And then eventually, there is a building that is now Guardian Care, is it assisted living facility? But that at one point in time was the African-American hospital in Orlando. So a lot of, again, when you talk about segregation, you're talking about separate facilities or portions of a facility that are dedicated just to being seen or just to Black people. And a lot of times these are not the choice parts, right? This is not the penthouse that we're reserving. It's more of the basement. It's more of the boiler room. It's more of the space that no one else would want to occupy. That is the space in which Black people were seen or cared for in a lot of areas.
All right, can you just,
Oh, I was just going to say that as time went on, more and more physicians either came to the area, or more people who were in the area trained to be physicians. So as time went on, you did see an increase in Black doctors. And so you'll have like Dr. James Smith, you'll have like Dr. Hankins. So you had an increase in accessibility as time went on. So you're talking later, maybe 50s, 60s, 70s. That's when you really started to see a greater increase in the amount of medical professionals, African-American medical professionals.
can you describe the Washington Shores Savings and Loan? What impact did it have on Paramore, and what problems did it address?
Sure. The Washington Shores Federal Savings and Loan was actually formed by 5 businessmen, none of whom were bankers. But what they were seeing, and this is in the 60s, what they were seeing is that African Americans were being cut off from loans and economic backing. It was harder for Black people to get loans, either to buy property, to buy homes, to start businesses, to get lines of credit. And so if you're larger, or what we would say, I guess, traditional banks were even willing to do it, then the interest rates were astronomical, or the things that Black people had to do in order to qualify were almost out of reach. It was unreasonable. So these gentlemen got together and formed their own bank for the sole purpose of allowing and increasing access to funding for African Americans. The bank itself physically was located on Goldwyn Avenue in Washington Shores, hence why it's called the Washington Shores Federal Savings and Loan. And it really was to increase loans and lines of credit. And so through that bank, more African Americans were able to buy homes, more African Americans were able to purchase land, have lines of credit, and start businesses that they normally would not get funding from your traditional banks. And that was the 100% sole purpose of that bank starting.
Would you be able to discuss the efforts to protect Paramore's history, and especially what role does the WellsBuilt Museum play in those efforts?
I think it is easy to see that Paramore is changing. Paramore is growing, and more businesses are coming to Paramore. Obviously, we have the downtown campus that has come to Paramore, the soccer stadium that has come to Paramore. And so as these new things come, there is always the danger that the old will be erased. And I think it is important to be able to understand what Paramore once was, as far as historically speaking. And so there is a concerted effort, certainly by the WellsBuilt Museum, by PAST, the nonprofit that operates the WellsBuilt, to make sure that the history is not just observed, but in fact honored, and that there is participation in the economy by Black businesses currently. We want to be sure, very much like when Paramore was thriving and you had Black businesses that were sustained and growing, we want to see that again. And so when you talk about bringing money to an area, bringing dollars to an area, bringing customers to an area, we want to see that as many people across all demographics are able to participate economically in the benefit. And so we need to be able to understand that and understand that Paramore is not just an extension of downtown. Paramore is its own area and has its own heritage and its own history.
You kind of answered this question, but how has redevelopment in Paramore, like the Amway Center, the soccer stadium, and the downtown UCF Valencia campus changed Paramore?
Well, I think just from a physical standpoint, starting there, it's completely different. They've rerouted roads and they've moved things. And I personally am an Orlando native. I grew up in Orlando, and I go down and sometimes I don't recognize it because there's so much new development that is happening. But to your point, we want to be sure that the people who live in Paramore currently, the people who work in Paramore currently, are able to participate in as much benefit as anyone else. And so if the Amway is bringing millions of dollars, we want to see a portion of those dollars go to the people who are already there, the people who grew up there, the people who have homes there. And so that to me is one of the greatest things. You don't want to disenfranchise the people who are already there. There is a whole community of people who live there and have lived there, and their mothers and fathers have lived there, and their grandparents have lived there. And we don't want to disenfranchise them by bringing wholesale what's new and eliminating what is.
Last question from the list. What challenges and opportunities do you see for the future of Paramore?
Well, I think as far as opportunities, they're great. I think the opportunities exist. We do on a daily basis, we understand that there are businesses coming, that there are apartments going up, that there are restaurants coming down. I think the challenge is, again, and I probably sound like a broken record, the challenge is making sure that the people of Paramore are participating in all of these things that are coming. It does no good if the people who live there now, who work there, who are educated there, cannot get the jobs or go to the restaurants or participate or earn an income and a living wage. And so that to me is the biggest challenge that I want to see addressed, is that the community that is there participate in as much of what's coming as possible.
Thank you. And do we have any follow-up questions that we want to ask?
I had a follow-up a little bit about the balancing the emergence of new businesses and making sure that the community isn't replaced, as we can see with a lot of gentrification. Do you have any cities or communities around the US that you think are good examples of a good process in that department?
That's a good question. I can't recall right offhand. I will say that I would have to do more research. I don't like to speak on things that I don't have a lot of knowledge on. So I would have to do more research about that. So I won't say right now. I would really have to look into it a little bit more.
Anyone else?
This is just like out of curiosity about the WellsBuilt Hotel, like when it was first built. Do you know like what services they had there, or like some of the like first like businesses on the storefront area?
As far as services, I mean, it really was a hotel. So it was going to be a place where African Americans could go and stay. One of the things that I'll point out, Thurgood Marshall stayed at the WellsBuilt Hotel for a period of some weeks while he was helping in the appeal case for the Groveland Four. And so I don't know if you all are familiar with the case in Groveland, but Thurgood Marshall, who was a civil rights attorney before he became the first African-American Supreme Court justice, he was a civil rights attorney. And so he and the NAACP a lot of times would work in tandem to identify cases that would have national impact for African Americans. And that case in Groveland was one of those cases. And so Thurgood Marshall traveled to the area. Now the case in Groveland involved the Groveland sheriff, who was known to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And normally what would happen is that Thurgood Marshall would stay in whatever city or town he was in, with an African-American family. The law enforcement of Groveland had warned the African-Americans in Groveland not to give housing to this lawyer coming to cause trouble. Don't let him stay with you. And had they probably would have put their own properties and families in danger. So he needed to stay at a hotel. And he consulted the Negro Motorist Green Book. And the nearest hotel that he found to Groveland is the WellsBuilt Hotel. Now, I'm not sure where everybody lives, but Groveland and Paramore are not by any means close. And so for that to be the nearest hotel gives you an idea of, one, how many or how few hotels were renting rooms to African Americans. And so the main service was to provide a place to stay, was to provide comfortable, clean lodging that Black people could partake in. So that was the main service. Downstairs, some of the businesses, and so some of those businesses, the downstairs portion continued to serve as storefront even after the hotel ceased to serve as a hotel. So I say that to say there were several businesses over several decades, furniture stores, insurance. I think at one point there was a kind of dinette, though there was no full kitchen. So the businesses changed over several decades, but there were a number of businesses that operated in that downstairs, because again, there was a span of at least 3 or 4 decades that the downstairs portion was offered as storefront.
Okay, thank you. Before we leave, is there anything you would like to tell us that we didn't ask you?
I don't. You guys have been very comprehensive, so I appreciate that. So I don't think so. I don't think so. I think I'm good.
All right.
But I know Professor Lester, she knows how to reach me.
Yes.
And so if there are any other questions, you feel free to let her know, and then I'll do my best to get you the information.
Okay. This oral history has been conducted on November the 6th, 2020, with Elizabeth Thompson. And the participants in this oral history are members of the class at UCF on U.S. democracy and capitalism. My name is Connie Lester, and the other participants in this oral history are Colton Wedge, Daniel Gabriel, and Paola Gary. And we thank Elizabeth Thompson for her time and for this great oral history. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.